So there are kind of two sides to this high pass war that has been raging for a long time, and I'm sure you've seen people debate this online. There's a whole bunch of people that think you should high pass absolutely everything. There's a whole bunch of people that think you should high pass basically nothing. But like with most things in life, and most things in audio, what we probably should do, what you probably should do, is somewhere in the middle. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, I'm Cole Caparoon. Thank you for stopping by for another video. First, real quick, an update. This room is getting really close. I don't know if you can see behind me, but it's getting really, really close. If you don't follow me on Instagram, be sure to follow me on Instagram. I'll put a link down below because I'm posting updates every single time I finish something. I'm posting progress, updates on my Insta story constantly. So if you're interested in watching the daily progress of this whole project, follow me on Instagram, and again, link down below. But I'm getting really pumped, and be on the lookout for the video because there will be a whole video. It'll probably be the biggest, most in-depth video I've ever made, going over the construction of this room. But let's talk about high passing, because that's why we're really here. That's why you clicked on this video, right? Now, there are three things that get drastically impacted by whether or not you high pass things. And the first one is the overall sonic character of the low end and of the sub bass of your mixes. Two, the actual low end character of each individual thing that you may or may not be high passing. And three, and this is the thing that most people don't think about or don't even realize, how loud your mixes can actually get to in the mastering phase. If you get the low end right on every single track, the potential for your masters to be significantly louder it's much better. You can get them much louder if you get your low end totally sorted. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about some principles and how I think about this and how I approach deciding whether or not I should high pass something or not high pass something. And then what I want you to do is I want you to take these ideas and these principles and I want you to test them for yourself. Because just because some idiot like me says on YouTube that you should high pass or you shouldn't high pass, you should know whether or not you should and when you should and when you shouldn't. And you should know that because you've done your own testing. I really want to encourage people to test these hypotheses for themselves and not just because one of us idiots on YouTube says that you should or shouldn't do something. First of all, let's talk about the overall low end of your mix. If there are a bunch of things that are fighting with each other, for the sake of this video, we're going to talk about low end below 100 hertz. Just to make it simple. If there's a bunch of things happening below 100 hertz, they can be fighting each other, and it's very common that they do. And so the idea is we want to high pass some of this stuff to eliminate some of that low end frequency from things that are not necessary and do not add to the overall low end of our mix. For instance, if you look at a vocal, if you pull up an EQ like a fab filter on a vocal, chances are you're going to see a whole bunch of rumble down in like 30 hertz. That doesn't need to be there. It adds absolutely nothing to the vocal. It doesn't even matter if you're working on a Barry White type vocal. 30 hertz in a vocal does absolutely nothing. It doesn't need to be there. And chances are it's the singer's feet shuffling around. It's the HVAC running. It's not actually even from their voice to begin with. But that 30 hertz that is in that vocal, believe it or not, it will impact the bass guitar and the kick drum and the cleanliness of the low end in your mixes. And so as a general rule of thumb, what I try to do is I look at each individual track, guitars, acoustic guitar, piano, kick drum, bass guitar, bass synths, vocals, vocal harmonies, etc., etc. And I think, does the low end, and we're talking stuff below 100 hertz, does it add to what this instrument or vocal sounds like in a good way? And if it does not, then I high pass it and I get rid of it if there's actually information there. So that 30 hertz in that vocal, it does nothing to add to the character of the vocal or the sound of the vocal, and it exists, so I need to get rid of it. To the contrary, a lot of electric guitars, if you pull up that same Fab Filter EQ and you look at what's happening in an electric guitar, on most electric guitars, there's very little happening down below like 80 or 90 hertz. There's usually just not much there. You can't even see any of it. And so if that's the case, then I will not high pass those guitars because there's nothing there to high pass. Now, why wouldn't you just high pass everything that doesn't need this sub bass, just so that way you're covered? This is where we get into the phase relationships of high passing. When you high pass something, it changes the phase of that particular track. And you can do this experiment, and I would encourage you to do so. If you take a kick drum and you duplicate that kick drum, so now you have two identical kick drums, and you put an EQ, like a fab filter, on one of those two kick drums, and you high pass it. And then once you've high passed it at 100, 120 hertz, switch that EQ back and forth between zero latency, natural, and linear phase. And listen to how the low end changes, even though you're not changing the low end or the high pass at all. It totally, totally changes. And what this proves is that when you high pass something, you are affecting its phase relationship. And this becomes really important on multi-mic'd sources. For instance, a kick drum. Nearly every time I ever track drums, there are at least two microphones on the kick drum. There's at least an inside and an outside microphone. But commonly, there's 4 microphones on a kick drum. And so I will usually use a kick inside mic and like a kick sub mic, so that way, and I blend those in order to create my overall kick sound that I like. But if we start high passing stuff, it will totally change the phase relationship. So on that kick sub mic, I will commonly do a band pass, which is a high pass and a low pass. And I will commonly high pass that sub kick at 25 or 30 hertz. It depends on the drum and the song. And then I will commonly low pass it somewhere around 80. And so what that does is that gives me a sub kick on a single fader that I can push up and make the kick drum thicker or not thicker. And that's what I like doing. However, you have to use a linear phase EQ when you do this if you don't want the relationship to the actual kick microphone to change completely. And so this is really, really important. So that experiment, that principle establishes that high passing something does change the phase of a track, which means if there's a guitar on that track and there's no information down there, what's the point in even messing with it? If you don't need to high pass something to eliminate low end that doesn't add to the character of that instrument, then you're better off just leaving it alone. As opposed to that vocal that's got that 30 hertz rumble in it, that absolutely needs cleaned up because it doesn't add to the character of the actual vocal itself, and it absolutely will eat up headroom, which will keep your mix from being the loudest it can possibly be, and it also will absolutely take away from the cleanliness and from the tightness and the accuracy that you're looking for in the low end of your overall mix. So this is how I look at high passing on every single instrument. And every single instrument will get a different frequency of high pass. For instance, I do high pass every single thing that has information all the way down to 20 hertz. My kick drums, my bass guitars, my bass synthesizers, 808s, pads, absolutely all of it. Now, what frequency I high pass at depends on the character I'm looking for that particular instrument. For instance, if I have a kick drum and the power of a kick drum or the power of an 808 is usually somewhere in the like 70 to 90 hertz range. That's where like the impact comes from in the power. Now the thickness or sometimes the looseness of a kick drum is down there in that like 20 and 30 hertz range. So what I will do on every single kick drum, no matter what, is I will start high passing at 20 hertz and I will sweep that frequency up until I achieve the right balance of that looseness and gooiness with the power. That balance, I use the high pass frequency to adjust that balance between gooiness and looseness and power and tightness. And that's why it's different on every single song, no matter what. Now, because I am changing the phase relationship of that, I use a linear phase EQ anytime I'm high passing any low end any tracks with low end information like a kick drum or a bass. Now I do the same thing. Let's say we've got a piano and a bass synthesizer and a bass guitar happening. Now all of those have to play nicely with that kick drum. And so a piano, while there's commonly information all the way down to 20 hertz, it doesn't usually add that much to the sound of the piano unless we are specifically going for a specific piano sound that's super thick. But usually what I'll do, and again, song dependent, I will high pass the piano up in somewhere around 100 hertz. So that way that piano, that 50 hertz of that piano is not competing with the 50 hertz of the bass guitar. And this does two things. This lets the low end of the bass guitar feel more accurate and more well-defined and tighter, and it also keeps me from eating up headroom in my mix bus that would keep me from having my mixes as loud as they could potentially be. So I make that decision on the piano because it doesn't add to the sound that I'm looking for, and it will compete with the bass guitar, so it gets a high pass. Now, do I use a linear phase EQ on that piano? It depends. If there are, let's say there's a stereo like direct piano microphone and there's a stereo room piano microphone, then there are multiple microphones and I want to keep their phase relationship the same. In that case, I will use a linear phase EQ. If there's just two close microphones on the piano, then it doesn't really matter if I use a linear phase or not, because I'm not worried about its relationship with other microphones on that same instrument changing. I hope that makes sense. It's a really hard concept to kind of explain. Before we go on, I just want to say there are links in the description of this video and of every video of mine. And those links go to Sweetwater. And anytime you guys need absolutely any piece of gear whatsoever, you can hop on any one of my videos, click on any one of the links in the description below. And once you're on the site, you can purchase absolutely anything that you were gonna buy anyway. Costs you nothing extra, but it goes a long ways to help support this channel, help me keep making content just like this. So thank you guys for using those links anytime you need to purchase absolutely anything. Thank you, Sweetwater, for sponsoring this video. I appreciate you, and I appreciate Sweetwater. Back to it. Let's recap here. If there is an instrument like a guitar that has no information down below 100 hertz and you can see that it doesn't exist, then there's no reason to high pass it, in my opinion. If you have an instrument like a piano, and there is a lot of information down there, then you have to determine whether or not it's going to be competing with the low end of other elements in the mix. And if it is, you need to choose which one of those instruments has priority. Does the bass guitar have priority at 50 hertz, or does the piano have priority at 50 hertz? Now, in every song I've ever mixed, the bass guitar would have priority at that sub bass over the piano, for sure. When you get into like a bass synthesizer and a bass guitar together, you have to choose which instrument gets that priority and high pass one of them out of the way of the other one, so that way that low end can be clean and tight and accurate feeling. On every kick drum ever, I high pass all of them, and higher than you might think, sometimes up to like 35 hertz, depending on the song, depending on the vibe, depending on what we're going for, and the actual sound of the kick drum itself. But I will high pass it however high I need to get rid of however much looseness and sloppiness I want to get rid of. That's literally my metric on how I do this. It's so easy for all of us to just want the thickest, biggest low end possible. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because the more you carve up this low end, and the more you, with good intention and making good mix decisions, the more you sculpt this low end, usually the better it gets. And the more you get rid of this low end, of that 30 and 50 hertz in that vocal, and the more that you clean stuff up so the piano isn't fighting the bass guitar, and the more you use those techniques so that way the kick in mic and the kick out mic play nicely together, the better your low end will get, and the more accurate it will feel, and the more solid it will feel. Because there's nothing worse than floppy, loose, gooey bottom end that lacks definition and lacks cleanliness. And it's usually because there's too much down there in like 20 hertz. It's almost 100% of the time where the problem comes from. There's actually too much going on down at like 20 and 25 hertz. So spend some time experimenting with this, run these experiments, duplicate those kick tracks, play around with linear phase versus natural phase EQs, and really hone in on why you do what you do. Experiment when you're not actually mixing something, so that when the time comes for you to actually mix something, you already know what you're doing, and you know why you're doing it, and you're not second guessing it because you've spent the time experimenting on it. I really hope that this helped you. Don't forget links down below for everything. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram. Drop me a comment, let me know what you think. If you agree with this, if you disagree with it, if you have something to add to it, I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you made it this far in the video, I feel like I've earned your subscribe. But either way, whether you feel like it or not, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.